Recently, the open source community was pleased to learn that the source code for Winamp would be open sourced.
Heather thinks about software.
Winamp is a popular media player and toolkit originally released in 1997 and then sold in a series of acquisitions to wind up with Llama Group, a Belgian company. Winamp had a big fan following, particularly among small content creators, and its heyday happened during the Napster era. For those of you who were not alive then, that was about 2001. Napster was a peer-to-peer music sharing platform that was essentially a vehicle for copyright infringement and resulted in a lot of really great work for lawyers. Clearly, the Winamp player was no longer a viable commercial product, and for corporate code, that's usually a great candidate for an open source release. Sharing code like that generates goodwill and can give an aging code base new life. The release happened in late September 2024, but the repo was just deleted due to a crazy quilt of problems that pretty much reads like an issue spotting checklist for doing an open source release. First, the code was not released under an open source license. The Winamp collaborative license, version 1.0.1, is the kind of silly, stingy license that happens when engineers want to open source some code, and then the lawyers, or perhaps their clients, who have no understanding of open source, start putting their 2 cents in. It did not allow distribution of modified versions, one of the primary tenets of open source licensing, and something that is even allowed by most corporate limited license releases these days. An original author of the code, Justin Frankel, called the terms completely absurd. Then, the code contained what an Ars Technica article called a hodgepodge of code licenses and the source code for other non-open software packages, including the proprietary code of Intel and Microsoft. The code release apparently also leaked other code owned by Llama that was not part of Winamp and probably was not intended for release. Reading between the lines, Llama, no relation to Meta by the way, regretted its release and deleted the repo, perhaps to try again later. There's a great comment in the Ars Technica article. I worked at Winamp till this February. I was the one that suggested we'd open source all the player code that belonged to us so that the community was free to do whatever it wanted with it. I envisioned something a la Doom GPL release. That proposal was repeatedly ignored by management, which couldn't be convinced that this decades-old spaghetti code had nothing more than historical value. Why would we want to give our IP away? We paid for that. The 4 legacy player devs got fired before we could clean up the code for publication. I left soon after. I was surprised when they announced the code release. Sadly, as the world has now witnessed, this release is a shit show. I'm so disappointed. This comment shows the level of disconnect that can happen between engineers and management when companies contemplate open source software releases. Though such tension is common, this is actually the worst and most embarrassing example I've seen. If a company wants to do this right, they usually need legal counsel who understands how to do an open source release. Anyway, I'll put a short due diligence checklist in the video description for the next company who decides it's too expensive to hire a lawyer who actually knows how to do this. It's not that expensive, by the way. But for most viewers who couldn't care less about legal missteps except to ridicule them, the interesting point is that if you are going to do an open source release of legacy code base, you should really do it right. The point of doing the release is to empower an open source community and get some good PR for your company, maybe play the poltergeist by disrupting some competitor's legacy product, or allow a valued employee to produce a side gig dream. But doing it wrong is both embarrassing and pointless. Meanwhile, presumably some people are gleefully using the code that was mistakenly released. I'll link to a couple of good articles in the description. Liking and subscribing makes me think more.
Heather thinks about software.